Okay, my name is Stephen O'Grady. I am the principal analyst and co-founder of RedMonk. RedMonk is an industry analyst firm. How many of you in the room know what an industry analyst firm is and does? Okay, a couple of you. So an industry analyst firm, for those of you who are not aware, and actually, if you want the slides, they're up right now. You can pull them down. An industry analyst firm essentially tracks trends, tracks the trajectory of certain technologies in the market, and RedMonk specifically does a lot of work with developers. So what I'm here today to talk to you about essentially is the trends that we're seeing around open source specifically and how that affects what all of you do in terms of the work that you do in and around commerce more generally, but x-commerce specifically. So jumping into it, this is a question. About 6 months ago, we were doing a lot of research in terms of the nature of the software business, where people were making money in software. And we had a sort of interesting finding. So I want to see if any of you kind of pick out the trend here. So this is a bunch of vendors. Check the logos. Does anybody have any idea what these vendors have in common? I'm sorry? That's actually a very good guess. Anybody else? Salesforce, that's a good guess as well. The correct answer is that these are PwC's Global Software Top 20. All right? And actually, before I continue, just if we have a small enough group, if you have questions, just raise your hand all the way through the presentation. The only thing you have to do is talk into a mic because we are being broadcast on the internet. But anyhow, these are PwC's Global Software Top 20. And what that means is that PwC went out and looked at the amount of money that people derive specifically from software. You know, how much money do you make in your software business? So just to be clear, Apple, for example, doesn't fare well in this chart, not because they're not tremendously successful as a technology organization, but rather because they don't really sell software specifically. They sell a combination of software and hardware. But anyhow, this is the chart. It's an eye chart. Don't worry about where everything stands. Ultimately, what this is a simple stack bar chart. The small stack essentially is, to the left-hand side, is the amount of money in billions that is being made from software specifically. So, there may be a couple surprises on here for you, but in general, this probably looks much like you'd expect. As the gentleman here in the front suggested, it is very heavily enterprise. Not surprisingly, because enterprise has traditionally commanded a substantial margin. The interesting thing is that they have something else in common. Anybody guess what this is? I'll be very impressed if you get this. Any ideas? Support open source. That's a very good guess. They're all founded before 1989. Everyone on that top 20 list was founded before 1989. So for those of you who are bad at math, myself included, 1989 was 22 years ago. So it's been a little while. A couple things that happened in 1989. Soviet Union left Afghanistan. Time and Warner merged, which does sound actually pretty funny now, given everything that's going on. The Exxon Valdez spilled all its oil in Alaska. Tiananmen Square. Rain Man won Best Picture, and very near and dear to my heart, the Sega Genesis was released. It was a very good Christmas in the O'Grady household. And some show called Seinfeld premiered. So if you actually do the math, if you go look at the top 20, the average age of the top 20 software companies, in fact, is 47 years. Now think about that. Right? I mean, think about how quickly things change in this industry, how quickly things turn over, where it can be a matter of months, and you can go from, the outhouse to the penthouse or the reverse. But the average age of these guys is 47 years. Now, to be fair, there are a couple anomalies on here. IBM, for example, was founded in 1911. There probably weren't a lot of computers in 1911. Obviously, they were doing a lot of their business around manual adding machines and so on. So it's not terribly relevant to what we're here to talk about. NEC, this surprised me when I looked it up, was founded in 1899. Right? So we have a couple outliers in there. But if we drop those, it's 31 years. So that's a lot less than 47, but 31 years is still pretty old. Which is kind of surprising. In this business, as fast-moving as it is, you might expect that things would be a little different. You might expect, in fact, that we would have businesses younger, significantly younger than 31 years, that would be making a lot of money from software. Seems pretty logical. But at the end of the day, so what? Isn't this kind of just business as usual in the sense that big, older companies outsource risk, and they do that by acquiring smaller ones, right? So, I don't know, any of you know Paul Graham? Heard that name? Okay, Paul Graham is essentially the head of Y Combinator. It's a VC incubator. And, he likes to say, look, if you're a big company and you want to produce a browser, what's going to be more effective? You staffing an internal team to try to build the perfect browser, or letting 10 startups build 10 browsers and then buying the best of them? It's probably going to be the latter, right? So this has been a traditional process. So in some sense, this all makes sense, right? You have big companies acquiring smaller ones, so the smaller ones never exist long enough to get into that top 20. So in other words, the correlation should be pretty strong between the age of a company and the size of its revenue. But there's a couple problems with that. If older is bigger, why is Microsoft the biggest? And again, remember, we're talking about revenue specifically derived from software. So Apple is obviously more, has surpassed Microsoft, but we're talking specifically about software here. So why would Microsoft be bigger? They're certainly not the oldest. I'm sorry? Well, that's exactly right. There are a lot of interesting reasons, which we'll actually go into in just a moment, for that. But it does, offer problems with our theory, right? So in other words, if we're positing that, look, the older you get, the more revenue that you're going to accrue over time, and clearly there's going to be a lot of people that flame out and go out of business. But the guys that stick around, in theory, should be the biggest. Microsoft, that doesn't work. But there's a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is with our definition of what a software company is. So this is just a very, very simple chart. This is the top 10 of the list that we saw. Right? So if we take the top 10 out of the top 20 from PwC's ranking, and then just look at their current market cap, so what the market believes the company is worth. So this chart, actually, there's really nothing remarkable about it. Apart from the fact that, HP is a little bit further down the list, that doesn't really fit the curve. Everything else is, pretty well where it should be. But what if we used a different definition of what a software company was? One that included companies that didn't necessarily sell software at all, but rather just produced and consumed it. So this is the same chart that we just saw with eBay included. So eBay obviously isn't a software company the way that, say, Microsoft is. Right? You're not buying your own sort of personal eBay marketplace and installing it at home, and selling amongst your family. It's a very different model. But it turns out that it's a very sizable model nonetheless. Right? If you put them in, they're actually sixth place. Sixth place in that whole list in terms of what the market believes that company is worth. So, back to our age question, when was eBay founded? 95. So that doesn't work anymore. All of a sudden, the list that we looked at before, the top 20, they're all 22 years or older. This is substantially younger. And PayPal's even younger. Anybody know when PayPal was founded? PayPal employees excluded? PayPal was founded in 1998. So now we have a problem. And the problem is that, our model of how we're making money from software has changed. So the lesson, correlation between revenue and age, actually, if you look at it, is actually pretty weak. And it's weak depending on, again, on how you define what a software company is, which is the second lesson. Building software for sale is just one path to revenue. There are a lot of different ways to go about it. And many of you in the room probably know this very, very well. What we talk about, and this I think was on the abstract for the talk, is making money with software rather than from software. All right? So eBay is a perfect example. PayPal is a perfect example. They're not selling you software. They're using software to make a profit. They're using software to make money, in which, again, many of you in the room are doing, with the APIs and the services that's offered. So the way that we usually explain this, there's 4 stages. They're very basic. Hopefully everybody in the room can understand this no matter what your background is. So stage 1 is IBM. This goes back to the 60s and 70s. IBM essentially was in the business of making hardware. Right? We talked earlier about how they were, they built the computational adding machines before there were computers. Once computers came around, they made very, very large computers all the way down to very, very small computers. So PCs. Now, IBM didn't care about the software. They didn't care what was running on this hardware. They only cared about selling more hardware. So from an IBM perspective, the money wasn't in the money was in the hardware, not the software. So they let a small company come along and make their operating system for the PCs, which was Microsoft. Microsoft had a fundamentally different attitude about what the value for software was. They didn't care about the hardware. Jeff Rakes from Microsoft famously said, I don't know who's going to win, sort of the hardware market, but I know that Microsoft is making software for all of them. And that's ultimately what it's about. This goes back to the point earlier. Microsoft perceives an opportunity inherent in the value of software. And to this day, this informs everything they do. If you think, for example, about the way that Microsoft pursues its intellectual property claims on Android today, that stems from the fact that they believe that the money is in the software. When they insist on licensing in the cloud, which makes them, in some cases, it's tough to compete with free. It's tough to compete with Linux in the cloud because it's much cheaper for providers to do that. Again, they believe fundamentally that the value is in the software. And actually, things were that way for a long time until we got to the 90s. So Google comes along and says, software is differentiating. We use it, but the money's not in the software. Right? The money for them obviously is in the advertising. So from Google's perspective, what's the value of software? The value of software in their cases was essentially to differentiate themselves from the competition at the time, the Alta Vistas of the world. Alta Vista was purchasing big, expensive, heavy machinery. Google purchased really crappy white boxes that nobody cared about. They ran software on it that they never had to pay for and that they could customize to do what they wanted. Now, I'm sure many of you in the room were probably around for the dot-com boom. I was a consultant at the time. And what the consultants would tell the just funded startups was basically you had to go out and get a couple things. You had to go to Sun for your operating system and hardware. You had to go to Oracle for your database, EMC for your storage, BEA for your app server, and so on. That stuff ran fine. There's nothing really wrong with it. Those are credible products. It just cost a ton of money. And in Google's case, that was never going to work. You couldn't scale Google that way. So instead, they did it their way. And they don't open source most of their core infrastructure. They talk about it. So instead of releasing, for example, their MapReduce implementation as open source, they release details of how they do it. Same with their file system, and so on. So they believe it has value, and they believe that it is differentiating, but the money isn't in the software ultimately. So then we get to stage 4, the last stage. It's just Web 2.0. And again, there's thousands of examples we could talk about here. Facebook is one of the sort of most common. Software is not even differentiating. I don't know how many of you know the kinds of things that have come out of Facebook, but Facebook has, for example, a project called Hive that they started. Hive is a SQL-like layer that sits on top of Hadoop. So instead of having MapReduce people crawl their data, they can have SQL people do it. They release this as an open source project. They did the same with Cassandra, which is their sort of hybrid key value store column database. These are things that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, nobody would ever consider doing because these were differentiating. These were a competitive advantage. But we're at the point now in the market where they don't care. This isn't how they compete. This isn't how they're better than somebody else. It doesn't matter. And this is a more and more common behavior that we see every day from companies that are younger and just don't view software either as having money in it or even potentially being technically differentiating. That's just not the point. So the lesson is that open source ultimately is everywhere. eBay, for example, has a ton of Hadoop, and actually have a ton of Hadoop jobs last I saw, if any of you in the room are in the market for that. Twitter is open source key portions of its infrastructure. Storm, it's sort of real-time MapReduce-like project. FlackDB, they're a graph database. And again, they don't care. The value for them isn't in selling the software. Facebook, we've already talked about. Google, we've talked about. Amazon.com. EC2, Amazon Web Services. How many of you use Amazon Web Services? Okay. Most of that's built on open source technology. Some of it they wrote, some of it's off the shelf, but it's open source technology. PayPal, likewise, has extensive open source investments. And Apple, I'm sure this isn't sort of a revelation to most of the people in the room, but Apple, the core of any of you using Macs in the room, the core of that is an open source piece of software. So open source is increasingly being written by people who aren't writing software to sell to somebody. They're not writing software necessarily to sell to you. They're writing software to solve a problem. And that's why, with the exception of MySQL on this list, all of these pieces were written to solve a given problem, written by somebody in business to do something else. Again, this is different. This is something that we haven't seen before. We have essentially come full circle since the 60s and 70s. We've come full circle back to where we were from IBM, which was the money's not in the software. Gone through, the money is actually absolutely in the software, from Microsoft's perspective, right back to the money's not in the software. And of course, sort of near and dear, how many of you are Magento users here? All right, we have a handful. So again, this is the point from an open source perspective. You have a choice, right? And there's no right or wrong answer necessarily for these choices. But if you're using these services, one of the things that you need to think about is why and how is open source being used or not in some of the businesses that we've been talking about. What is the trend, right? Because you don't want to necessarily invest on the wrong side of a trend. But when it comes to Magento, when it comes to an open source platform, as I said, you have a couple of choices. One choice is to write it yourself, to not use any off-the-shelf software, and to just write yourself an e-commerce platform. What you have to answer then is, am I going to write such a good commerce platform that it's going to be worthwhile for me to do that? Can I out-innovate everybody from Magento all the way to Amazon? Are you going to be better at that? Probably the answer is going to be no. Maybe not. In which case, that dictates one choice. Another choice, of course, is to use commercial off-the-shelf software. That may be a perfectly valid choice. Nothing wrong with that. But increasingly, as we've seen, if the trend here is that the software itself is not necessarily the value, is not necessarily where the value is found, then that may lend you sort of more support, or that may push you towards the consideration of open source solutions like Magento. Now, the net of all this is what? Well, this I thought was pretty interesting. There was a 75-page research note published by one of the sort of finance analysts. This finance analyst tried to reconstruct what it would take to replicate YouTube, the site, everything involved with YouTube, on the Oracle Exadata platform. And what he found is that, absent the administrative costs and maintenance costs, which are also lower, what he found was this. If you're going to build YouTube on top of Exadata, it's going to cost you $589 million and change. If you're going to build it on open source and commodity hardware, it's going to cost you $104 million. Now, those numbers may not be as stark as as you might expect, but that's almost a 6x difference. So again, the lesson to be learned here, to be extracted here, isn't that open source is the right answer in every situation. It is not. But given the fact that, again, we have businesses over and over and over again deciding that, it doesn't make sense to pay for all of this software, and instead, the open source stuff is really good. I'm going to use that. These are the lessons that the web and the companies who built the web have taught us. So this realization triggered a couple waves of innovation. because it's not only the software costs that are coming down now. Any of you guys know InfoChimps? Anybody heard of it? Okay. One gentleman over here. InfoChimps is an interesting organization. They run essentially a data marketplace. You can go and buy and sell data sets. They have an API, the whole bit. Anyhow, as you know, sort of in the normal course of running their business, they do a lot of work on EC2. And this, I think, puts in perfect, this gives you perfect context for how, quickly things have changed from a hardware perspective. Right? The fact that anybody with a $10 bill can run a 10-node cluster with a terabyte of storage for 8 hours. I mean, think about how different that was from 5 or 10 years ago. It's insane. 5 or 10 years ago, if you could rent a 10-node cluster, you sure as hell couldn't do it for 8 hours, and sure as hell wasn't going to cost $10. The costs for the hardware have come down. Now, the costs for the hardware have come down. Why? Virtualization, Moore's Law, both right. But ultimately, they've come down because of the software. Because the software that providers are using to build these sites costs nothing, or it's very low cost. To go back to the point that we just made, it's much easier to offer YouTube for free when you build it for 100 million instead of 600 million. And that's ultimately what we're seeing from cloud providers. When you can assemble your infrastructure at a very, very low cost, you can then offer that at a very low cost and service a volume audience. But here's the problem, is that ultimately, if we spin up all these instances, we have all these cloud services and software being run. How do we connect everything? This I thought was interesting. Anybody in the room know Steve Yegge? Works for Google? We have one hand in the back. So Steve Yegge, I believe it's been pulled down since it originally went up. He posted this to Google Plus yesterday, I believe, day before maybe. Anyway, he goes on this very long rant about Google's inability to think like a platform provider. And this is the fundamental realization that Jeff Bezos came to, and he was not at all complimentary to Amazon apart from this particular insight. So Yegge, as the slide indicates, works at Google now. He spent 6 years at Amazon. And one of the things that happened was that basically Jeff Bezos put out this mandate. The mandate said all teams are going to expose their data and functionality through services interfaces. Teams must communicate through each other through these services. They can't use anything else. And ultimately, if you don't do this, you're fired. Now, that's obviously a very substantial incentive to get moving and to make progress, towards a service's goal. And ultimately, that's what we're talking about today, right? That's the position that many of you are in today, is that you have a wealth of resources available to you as services. And you have that because many of the same APIs that are used by these organizations, in the case of PayPal, in the case of eBay, are exposed externally. You have a services mindset that has had to come about and has had to evolve because of what open source has done in terms of basically accelerating the innovation on the software side, which in turn brought down the costs from a cloud side. And all of a sudden, we have lots and lots of nodes, lots and lots of services running everywhere. We need some way to connect them. The way that you do that is with services and with APIs. And to Bezos' credit, he saw that, rotated Amazon, and all of a sudden, you can get everything as a service. And that, again, is the reality that you are all faced with now at xCommerce. You have all of these assets. You just need to decide how and where to put them together. So what does this mean? It means that the world is increasingly composed of open source and services. But just as importantly, you need to think about what makes you different, right? Because ultimately, you have these services. You can build just another store, you can build another front end, you can build another retail interface. But your ability to be successful and your ability to exploit all of the advantages that open source, cloud, and the underlying APIs offers is going to be dependent on your ability to find unique and interesting ways to combine these, to offer new features. we've seen lots of examples of this over years, where there was a gentleman by the name of Alan Taylor, who now works, I believe, at the Atlantic. He used to work at the Boston Globe. And he put together services that combined Netflix, Amazon, Instapaper, I believe, and so on. He combined a bunch of external services in new and interesting ways, in a way that none of the organizations thought of themselves. And that's ultimately what it's all about. With that, I'm done. Questions? We need a mic, actually. All right, she's coming.
Going back to the slide of Oracle for $500 million and YouTube for on commodity for 104. That's all fine and well when we're talking about something like videos that when they go down, everybody gets disgruntled. If I'm the SWIFT network and I'm transferring $2 trillion a day for several 100,000 messages, I want to make sure that I don't get an accidental bit flip and move $100 million to the wrong account.
Yep.
And so this is the general case that in regulatory reasons why people will go for enterprise equipment and pay the $500 million because the cost of failure is so much higher in their particular industry.
Yep.
Banks, money networks, and so on and so forth. And that's, and then on the flip side, where you don't have that problem, open source makes a whole lot of sense because it has a better ROI and lower consequence.
Sure. I mean, in other words, if the point is basically that there are going to be certain situations where you're going to want to trust proprietary software, then that point is well taken. Right. There are lots of examples where, for example, in sort of existing infrastructure situations, right? Nobody's going to tell. I would certainly never tell any of our clients that, hey, there's these, open source solutions. You should go in and rip out all of your Oracle. Right? It doesn't make sense. You have to think about, the process, total cost of ownership, all those, kind of fun questions that analysts like to spend way too much time looking at. But at the end of the day, it's basically different tools, different jobs scenario, right? You have tools that are good at certain things, and those things importantly change over time, right? So there are things, for example, that would only have been trusted to proprietary solutions 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago. That's changed, right? So for anybody familiar with Bank Simple? All right. So Bank Simple, I would encourage you all to check it out. I don't believe they've launched yet. Bank Simple is a new. They're trying to rethink and reimagine the bank process, and they are using a ton of open source to do that. And they're doing it because it's a very skilled technical team, and they have the ability essentially to hammer on the different open source platforms that they have chosen to use. And they have determined which ones are scalable in their opinion, and which ones are not, which ones are secure and which ones are not. Certainly there are areas where proprietary software may have traditionally been used. It may still be appropriate, but it may also be time, in some cases, to think about using open source because it is proving itself in some fairly demanding conditions. This is the thing. I remember somebody telling me at one point that Xen, XEN, which is a virtualization, open source virtualization layer, wasn't ready for prime time at the same time that it runs all of the existing EC2 instances. Right? So those two things don't go together, if you follow. So anyhow, but yes, point well taken. There are situations where you absolutely want to use commercial software, and more power to you. I would just strongly encourage people to keep an eye on open source because it is making inroads into areas of the market where you never would have expected it. Question here?
Just a quick on a full circle. With the cloud, with the cloud, we know money isn't in the hardware. With virtualization, open source, we know money isn't in the software. Where's money now?
Where's the money now? The money is basically in services, but also in data. All right. So a lot of the research, the front part of this, the PwC part, came out of research that we were doing about the value of data. Right. So in other words, if you think about Facebook, if you think about Twitter, there's a famous saying: if you're not paying for a service, or if you're not a paying customer, you are, sort of, I'm butchering it. But anyhow, the point is that if, as a Facebook user, I don't pay them anything. Same with Twitter. But the way they monetize me is my data, right? That's essentially how they go about that. So for a lot of businesses, that's ultimately where their value is going to lie, is collecting large volumes of data and realizing revenue streams from that. And the basic things are what we know now, right? Are things like advertising and so on. But there are a lot of sort of interesting usages which we're not all aware of yet. So how many of you use smartphones? The traffic that comes from, actually that you can just get on Google Maps, that's the result of aggregated data, right? They track all those handsets phone back how fast they're going. You add up that data, and that data is now way more interesting, right? Because in other words, if my smartphone is telling somebody that I'm going 50 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, the only person who's going to care about that is probably my insurance company, right? But on the flip side, if everybody in this room is phoning home data, and we're all leaving San Francisco after this conference, that's a different thing, right? So that, in many respects, is where the money is. But for all of you, a lot of, certainly data I would point to, and I would strongly encourage you all to think about as a potential revenue source, but also the kinds of things that you can do in terms of combining services and giving an experience that people haven't seen before, right? Those are, there was, I mentioned InfoChimps earlier. One of the things that InfoChimps is doing, they have detailed census data, and they have detailed demographic data, right? So for advertisers, they can tell you, all right, if you want to send a circular on the launch, this new book reading, maybe you want to target that to neighborhoods which have a high percentage of college graduates, right? So this is what happens when you can begin to layer a bunch of different data streams together to combine and produce something new. So again, I think a lot of it's going to come from data, but a lot of it's also going to come from sort of interesting recombinations of existing services. Other questions? Right here.
Yes. My question is, how do you think about Microsoft Azure? Because basically I think they don't charge you by license. They charge you by usage, by traffic. So it's like Amazon, like Google. So they may have the similar structure. But as a Microsoft developer, use Microsoft tools. We compare the performance with other software. It's kind of a faster. So, but in the future, we think the infrastructure is more important. So everything is in the cloud. So what's your opinion about it?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, first, just sort of general thoughts on Azure. I think they've done a pretty nice job of iterating, I think, coming along. So for example, when they launched the service, in a misguided decision, in my opinion, they essentially had SQL services. That's what they were calling it. It was actually a hierarchical database. It didn't offer anything like SQL. That was just kind of a branding thing that they chose to do. Developers, by and large, freaked out and said, no, we're not using this. Give us a relational database. So they put it back in, right? So they essentially rebranded SQL Server, and so it's a little distinct. You can't, for example, physically address hardware. But in other words, it's an example of them responding to sort of customer needs and complaints. In general, what I would tell you is that the cloud has a lot of advantages. Certainly in terms of elasticity, ease of use, certainly on-demand availability, pricing, provisioning speed, and so on. For all that said, it's not the right answer in every case, Azure or otherwise. Right? You get, for example, horror stories told about, Amazon. For example, people think the performance is terrible and the reliability sucks and so on. We use it for a couple of our online applications. It's been fine, but at the end of the day, essentially, again, it's a set of choices. You can choose to have complete control over your infrastructure and run it yourself, or you can choose to have somebody else do that. And each of those choices is a set of consequences attached to it. And one of the consequences of having somebody else run things is that if things go wrong or performance isn't great, your control in terms of fixing that situation is limited. The only thing that I would offer as a counterpoint is that, we call this kind of like a shark attack problem, where people are terrified of sharks, absolutely terrified of getting attacked by a shark. Statistically, your likelihood of that ever happening is infinitesimal, right? You're much more likely to be struck by lightning every year in the United States than you are to be attacked by a shark. But our fear is disproportionate to the actual risk involved. And the same is true of the cloud. People are terrified of getting caught out in the cloud. But at the end of the day, are they really going to be better at running their infrastructure than Amazon, Rackspace, Google, Microsoft, whomever? I would suggest in the overwhelming majority of cases, you're not. They're probably going to be better at it than you are. And if you really, if it is that important to you, you're going to know that, and you're going to invest and pay the premium to have the kind of performance that you require. But most of us just don't need that. Other questions? Back here?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you a question about open source, but real quickly, what this gentleman was talking about was Swift and banking. I mean, I think your point was that it makes it cheaper, and Swift and ACH transfers are like $40. So, I mean, it really proves your point. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you what you think about the trend I'm kind of seeing in open source with this, you can get this version for free versus an enterprise version for this.
Yeah.
And I talked to other developers, and I remember when I first started asking about OpenTaps and Magento with some hardcore like OFBiz developers.
Yeah.
They cursed Magento, and it really goes against the grain of a lot of people's ideals. Mm-hmm. And I know from a business standpoint, I get nervous on a licensing fee. I'd rather pay $100,000 up front and not have the uncertainty. Are they going to raise the prices? What's going to happen?
Yeah. I think my general reaction to that would be it varies on a case-by-case basis, right? Because you have a lot of circumstances where the full product is available for free, and basically what you're paying for is support and services. So a perfect example of that, for example, is Red Hat. So you can get Red Hat Enterprise Linux not from Red Hat. There's a distribution called Senos, which basically is Red Hat, just not called Red Hat. It's called Senos. So in that case, what you're ultimately paying Red Hat for isn't some exclusive access to technology that they may or may not update or may not include. You're paying access for support services and simplified updates to the distribution itself. Right? So you're paying for something differentiated. Now, what you're talking about, I believe, is a case that's closer to what is called open core, or a hybrid open source model. What that means is that you have a core piece of functionality that's open source, but then let's say that you need clustering. The clustering is a proprietary product that you pay for on top of that. So, you have to make a choice, at some point. And maybe, in many cases, the calculus is exactly as you outlined. The hell with it, I'll pay $100,000, and I'll get full access to the product, and I don't need to ever worry about it. The question then becomes, though, in cases where there is a lot of traction, around a given open source project, is, are the vendors that you're paying going to be able to out-innovate the open source alternatives? And in a lot of cases, the answer to that is yes. But in some cases, the answer to that is probably going to be no. And like I said, I wish that there was some magic rule I could give you to say, in this case, do that, and in this case, do that. But it really still is on a sort of a case-by-case basis. Question?
Yeah, so maybe I'm asking for a magic rule. Are there different criteria that you have to use when you're evaluating using an open source package in terms of how you judge it for its appropriateness or longevity? No, there absolutely are. And again, it really depends on sort of the role that it's playing, right? So for example, if you're spinning up a departmental, or for a better example for this audience, if you're spinning up a sort of small retail, front end for a small business, they're probably not going to care if it's state of the art. They're probably not going to care if the product is revved every 3 months. In other words, basically what they want is a storefront. So in that case, you need to pay attention. You don't want to necessarily invest in a platform that's a dead platform, right? It's never going to be updated again. But your sensitivity to things like that is much less. Now, in cases where you're building real storefronts, real services on top of, for example, that are doing thousands, tens of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of transactions, you need to pay a lot more attention. And that goes for every component in your tool chain. So ultimately what you have to decide is, the stack that I'm using, whatever that stack is composed of, do I have confidence in this? And the way that you determine confidence, again, unfortunately varies, right? Because it varies by, for example, what is the number of committers attached to a given project? What is the volume of commits? How many organizations are involved? What is the licensing around it? All of these factors come into play. And that's, for example, we referred to MySQL earlier. So of these projects, MySQL, Mongo, Redis, I guess, is sort of iffy, are basically run strictly by that organization, right? They're responsible almost solely, there are exceptions, but they're almost solely responsible for the development. Contrast that with Hadoop, Linux, Jenkins. Those contributions come from all over the place, right? So in other words, you guys, I'm sure know this, Linux has lots of different commercial organizations that are involved in the development of that project. So in terms of your confidence in the health of that ecosystem, you should be pretty confident, right? I mean, you'd have to have something really catastrophic happen for that to not be a viable ecosystem anymore, if you do not have viable support. On the flip side, this is what has people concerned about MySQL. What if Oracle stops developing it? Now, the answer to that actually is that there's a very, very viable third-party ecosystem. And that is a massive commercial opportunity. So again, that's not going anywhere. It's going to be here for a while. But to your point, I mean, basically, yes, you need to think about excuse me, the viability and the provenance of these projects over the longer term. Just how and where you do that depends on the type of project and how strategic it is to your organization. Question? All set? All right. Thank you very much, guys. Appreciate your time.